The human brain is the most exquisite, complex thing we know of. A few pounds of electrochemical device that somehow powers me, my thoughts, my hopes, my aspirations. When I think of what that represents, that it looks out on a world, on a universe it's trying to understand, that just still sets the hairs on the back of my neck on end.
In science, the brain is the great mystery of life. Everything that we encounter in this world, every action we do, it's processed and controlled by the brain. And there are endless, endless questions. There's millions of neurons, there's so many circuits, and we are just at the beginning of trying to understand how it works.
Millions of years of evolution have had its impact to make a structure that's truly amazing, that endows us with the capacity to engage in art and learning and communication and language, the most amazing abilities.
The human brain is the source of cognition, thought, feeling, emotion, planning. It's perhaps the most complicated object in the universe, and we don't really understand, and we don't really have good theories for how it does what it does. That's what makes it such a wonderful object to study.
As far back as the ancient Egyptians, human beings have been trying to unlock the secrets of the brain. Now, thanks to recent technological advances, we can not only explore the world around us, but turn inward to examine the human brain in powerful new ways. World-leading scientists are on the brink of being able to cure disease, harness the power of artificial intelligence, and augment the brain to help create a better world. This film explores what we need to do to get there.
One of the things people may not realize about the brain is that there are many different ways of studying it and looking at it. Every year, the annual meeting of the Society for Neuroscience is attended by about 30,000 people. And if you were to drop 2 fish hooks into the meeting and pull out 2 neuroscientists at random, it's very unlikely that they would agree
on what is important to study about the brain and the best way to go about doing it. There are many different levels of organization at which you can study the brain, from the molecular level to the cellular level to the systems level. And there are people that approach the brain as an electronic instrument, and there are people who approach the brain from the standpoint of its chemistry. And these are all different, valid perspectives, but what is very challenging is to integrate them all together because the brain is so vast and complicated. Right now, we don't know enough about the fundamentals of how the brain works. This would be like trying to find a cure for bubonic plague in 15th century Europe without knowing about the existence of microbes, right? How can you even begin to approach this if you don't know that there's such a thing as viruses and bacteria? And that's how I define fundamental research. It's answering basic questions about the mysteries of life and the universe without any agenda to produce something. If everyone were doing, say, purely applied or what's now called translational research, I think the field would get into a real bottleneck because we wouldn't know where to go. We have to open up that bottleneck and make the fundamental discoveries, things that are there in the brain but simply haven't been uncovered yet. It sometimes feels like being an ant at the foot of Mount Everest. It feels insurmountably complicated sometimes, and that we're deluding ourselves into thinking that we're going to be able to make significant inroads on the timescale of one person's lifetime. But the field as a whole is making such progress that I think the ants are slowly moving in a way that we couldn't previously have imagined. We're in the middle of a revolution in technology for mapping, manipulating the brain, measuring activity, and marking the brain, to give you a place to sort of get your foot in the door and begin to tease apart the complexity in a systematic, step-by-step manner.
I'm a psychiatrist and I'm in a bioengineering department, but I'm also a neuroscientist, so it's a funny mix of things, but the common theme is I like to figure out how complicated biological things work. The way brain cells communicate is with electrical pulses. And the problem is all neurons use that exact same language. They all use this electrical language. And they're all intertwined. There's an immense tangled spaghetti type situation we've got on the brain. So if you want to just control one kind of neuron, you can't use electricity. You need something that none of the neurons respond to. And it's dark in the brain, and none of the neurons respond to light. And so that's great. And so if you could make them respond to light even a little bit, you'd have immense leverage. And that's the essence of it, is to find a way, how do you create little light antennas of some kind that are functional in just the cells that you want in the brain? We figured out in my lab a way to deliver a gene, a bit of DNA, from a microorganism, an algae, into neurons. And this gene receives light, and that gets neurons to fire. That whole package we called optogenetics, and it's really been very rewarding to see how it's spread around the world, thousands of labs, thousands of discoveries over the past few years. It doesn't matter anymore that it's a tangled bowl of spaghetti in there. We can just have one strand that we are turning on or off in behavior. Optogenetics gives us an insight, and then we can use that insight for any kind of treatment. It doesn't matter what kind of treatment. If we learn that depression, a particular kind of depression, is caused by one part of the brain not communicating well with another part of the brain, you can ask the following question. What happens when I stimulate this kind of cell? Or what happens when I turn off this kind of cell? What happens to the behavior? And this was a question nobody could ask before, and now you can ask it.
If you think about the current state of treatment for psychiatric disorders like depression, they're treated with drugs like Prozac that act by changing the chemical balance in the brain. That's a bit like trying to replace the oil in your automobile engine by opening the hood and pouring a can of oil all over the engine and hoping some of it runs into the right place. Some of it may, but a lot of it will run into places where it will do more harm than good. And so we can imagine if this field moves forward, I think over the next 10 to 20 years, there may be new therapies that target disorders like depression with a much greater degree of specificity so that you treat the disorder without all of the side effects that are accompanied by today's drugs.
I was not aware that something was wrong until I was in my early 30s. So it has been over 40 years that I've suffered with depression. On the scale of severity, my depression is totally debilitating. The physical pain, the mental pain, and the anguish are just maddening. You are more anxious, you're more tense, you're more nervous, you're more on edge. Then there are physical symptoms too. Continual headache, continual upset stomach, diarrhea, and it colors your whole life. It's, I guess I could say it'd be like having a bag over my head and wondering what the world is around me, but you can't see it because you're not able to fully interact with it.
Depression is the #1 most disabling condition in the world, per the World Health Organization. It surpassed cancer and heart disease in the last year. About 2/3 of patients tend to respond to traditional antidepressants. About 1/3 are what we call treatment resistant. They've largely failed medications, they've largely failed psychotherapy. They're really unable to do much else. And that's generally the patient that I see.
I've probably taken 20 to 30 different types of medications. All to no effect. Either the medication didn't work at all, or the side effects were so onerous that you felt like you were dying. I've tried various talk therapies and whatnot, and nothing has really helped.
Depression is a condition that at the brain circuit level is dysfunction in what we call the cognitive or thinking circuits and the limbic or mood regulatory circuits. There are a lot of researchers worldwide embracing transcranial magnetic stimulation. So what that is that's an electromagnet that is about the same magnetic field strength as an MRI scanner, but focused on a brain region. On the face of it, in and of itself, it's quite an effective treatment, but it doesn't capture particularly treatment-resistant patients. And so we developed a very powerful form of TMS derived directly from the same signal the brain uses itself, which is at an order of magnitude less time-consuming to apply.
After 1 week of treatment with him, my depression, for the first time, basically in 40 years, went away, and it was like heaven. It was like nirvana. It was like being reborn. My senses were all amped up. It was just, the whole world was anew to me. I have had a second week of treatment, and the benefits then lasted up to about 2 weeks, and I'm now looking forward to getting additional treatments.
This is a really dramatic finding. It's one that would allow for us to really get at an orphan population of depressed patients that normally don't have access to a treatment that would work for them and save a lot of lives.
When I'm totally remitted, I look forward to life. Life is like a giant candy bowl, and I want to dive in. My brain is working better. I'm able to do things. I have the desire, and it's just a wonderful feeling, a feeling of wholeness.
Emotions rule our lives, and everyone struggles with being able to control their emotions. And I think the more that we understand about what creates anger, what creates depression, what creates anxiety, the better we'll be able to have a mindful approach to fixing it.
With neuroscience, what we want to know is how does a nervous system achieve what it does in terms of sensation, cognition, behavior. Same problem in psychiatry. We don't know why it's happening, and so they really work well together.
Having worked with so many people suffering from mental disorders throughout my career, almost 25 years now, it's deeply moving. I see extraordinary heroism, incredible courage, living with terrible inner suffering and anguish. And you know, we don't give a diagnosis of mental disorders unless that suffering is such that a person's life is really changed. They have the inability to work, to love another person, to feel connected, to feel like they belong. The reason I became a psychiatrist is because there are so many people affected by mental disorders in this world. About 1 in 4 people live with mental disorders. That means that every person, every family, every community is touched by the hardships of mental disorders. Entire nations that have this extraordinary burden throughout their population. We also, with the aging of the world, we're seeing that dementias, Alzheimer's disease, for example, is more prevalent throughout the world, and we can expect that that will increase. Mental disorders are the leading cause of early death and disability in economically established countries, and it's number 2 throughout the entire world. So it's this catastrophic situation and has really been little recognized.
我们现在有500多种困扰全世界人民的疾病没解决，这500多种都是跟脑疾病有关系，包括了 精神病，包括了脑血管病、肿瘤、外伤等。这种靠一个国家是解决不了，必须全世界大家共同努力合作。因为我们这里是中国南方第一个建立神经外科的中心，52年。我从医50多年了，手术是超过1万多例。我们这里一个是神经外科临床中心，一个是研究所，第二个是我们是研究所，所以说我们要去开展一些研究工作，这包括了脑功能的研究、功能皮层网络、皮层下功能网络的联系大脑和小脑功能之间的连接。那么其他的包括了一些新技术。那么这样子就是通过脑科学、神经科学研究，既解决了我们临床问题，又解决了我们经济发展问题。脑科学应该是我们人类未来发展方向。
It's very exciting to be in the field right now. We've just got such amazingly creative neuroscientists throughout the world who are collaborating, and we have these very different techniques now, where instead of just inferring what happens in the brain, we can directly query and learn about what's happening in brain circuits, what's happening at the level of the cell, what's happening with the genetic configuration that leads to a particular brain disorder.
As a child of the 60s in the United States, one of the messages I got from my parents and from my school and the society overall is that in your life, being able to make a contribution to the world is really important. I've chosen science as the way to do that. And so having my research be relevant to the easing of pain and suffering in the world has been very important. My primary interest is in the mechanisms that control the development of the brain from the earliest point in life at birth and then through adolescence. When you see a child develop, it's natural to think about what's actually happening. If you imagine a newborn baby and how much change there is in the first year of life. I've developed a particular passion for understanding this one disorder, Rhett Syndrome. It affects about 1 in 10,000 girls. And you might think that's not a large number, but it's quite a devastating disorder. And it's my conviction that if we can understand how a single gene, when mutated, gives rise to aberrant brain development, that it might have an impact on our ability to understand more complex neurological disorders in general.
You bring a baby home from the hospital, and everything seems to be perfectly normal. And typically for the first year to year and a half, things are relatively normal. And then somewhere between 6 months to a year and a half, sometimes a little bit later than that, you start to get this feeling in the pit of your stomach that something just isn't right. The children stop developing normally. Sometimes they stop being able to feed themselves. They can't hold their bottle anymore. They get very cranky and they're crying. They stop sleeping at night. And then from there, you know, things get worse. as a parent, as you start to realize that your daughter is going to be severely, severely disabled, it's the worst feeling in the world, I think. It was almost unbearable. My daughter now at 21 is in a wheelchair. She's unable to speak. She has seizures. She's fed through a feeding tube. She has anxiety problems, musculoskeletal problems. She's very tight. I mean, the list goes on and on. She handles it with such grace and patience, and she has a sense of humor. She gives us so much affection, and she's amazing, and she's the soul of our family.
Our research has unfolded essentially over a 30-year period. And now with new technologies, for example, a method called single-cell sequencing, we're able to look at the individual cells to get really crystal clear answers that we've been seeking for a long time. We take some blood and put it into a dish and then convert those blood cells into human neurons that can be studied, and we can study differences in neuronal connectivity in terms of the wiring of the brain that underlie mental disorders. So we're very close to being able to pinpoint in the genome what's responsible, and that's the first step towards developing a therapeutic.
I don't expect a 100%, like it never even happened, cure for Chelsea. But I do think that there can be dramatic improvements. You know, could we lessen the rigidity? Could we get her walking? Could we have some hand use? Could she learn to speak again? I think those things are possible, potentially. We won't know until we try. But I think, you know, we're at the point now where we're going to have an opportunity to try, and that's really exciting.
This was something that even several years ago seemed to be impossible. And now we're facing a frontier of understanding this awesome structure and how it's made, how it's put together, and how it functions. I think that we're on the verge of a revolution.
It's very inspiring and very moving to be in this field because we really like to take on the hardest problems. And if you want a hard problem, this is it. Understanding how the brain works, how these disorders emerge in young people. These are mysteries that we're beginning to unravel. It's an extraordinarily exciting time, both in science and society, for neuroscience and the field of psychiatry. It will actually change the world. I really believe that.
You can think of a research laboratory like a small business. Our product is the research, and we have to support the development of research with funding.
Most people now in the US, young people, don't get their first NIH grant until they're 40 years old. And that's a long time to get to that point. And so there's a critical gap that needs to be filled of funding young people at early stages of their career.
I think these extraordinary young people are going to tackle the hardest problems, and they're going to come up with the answers. And we love, as I was saying earlier, we love the hardest problems because by going after the hardest problems, that's how you make the biggest difference.
It's quite difficult for young investigators starting up their careers to get enough resources to really do the riskier things. And this is a really important point. I think the role that private nonprofits play in this arena of how do you support science in a highly leveraged way so that you're putting your money where perhaps governments would not do is critical.
I was not the typical scientist. I grew up in the inner city of Chicago. I didn't know anybody who was a scientist. I was the first person in my family to go to college. And I always liked science, but I never thought about it as a career until I started working in the lab. And I guess I'm what you would call the typical lab rat. I loved being in the lab and spending all of my free time there, doing experiments and getting a result. As scientists, we always want to understand the unknown and make that new discovery and answer questions that people haven't asked before that hopefully very quickly could change people's lives.
When I first met her, you could just see there was a spark, and there's just amazing creativity. She epitomizes what I feel is sort of the next wave of scientists, because she's smack in the middle of one of the most interesting fields of neurobiology.
My lab studies the molecular mechanisms underlying itch, touch, and pain. Millions of people worldwide suffer from disorders that affect our sense of touch, and that includes chronic pain and chronic itch. And we're particularly focused on chronic itch these days because it's such a widespread problem with very few effective treatments. And one of the most common causes of chronic itch is eczema, which is often called the itch that rashes.
I was diagnosed with eczema when I was probably around 7 or 8 years old. I had a lot of rash on the inside of my elbows, behind my knees, which are very typical places that most people present with eczema. When I was in my 20s, I just had full-blown eczema head to toe. Skin is the largest organ of your body. So if your entire skin is covered in a rash, it itches, there's redness, there's broken skin from scratching because the itch is really unbearable, it's hard to get comfortable. Right now, I could scratch everywhere. My skin's tingling the whole time.
We know that for you to experience the sense of itch, your nervous system has to be activated, and we have to understand not only what's happening at the level of the skin, but how the nervous system gets triggered that starts this vicious itch-scratch cycle, where scratching that itch doesn't cause any relief, and it makes the disease worsen, actually.
My dermatologist said to me once, she goes, "Lisa, if you would just not scratch, your skin would look a lot better." And I thought to myself, yes, I know that, but I can't seem to turn my brain off so that I won't scratch that area. I just can't help but go there and scratch it.
In my lab, we record neuronal activity, and we also do imaging to look at structural regions of the brain, how disease changes the circuits, as well as induces changes at the molecular and cellular level. In the last 5 years, we started to first define the cells and the molecules that mediate our sense of touch and pain in the periphery, and we're just starting to take that information and build tools to start to decipher how higher level processing goes. We're going to really see exponential discovery in the next 10 years.
It would be amazing if Diana's research came to fruition and she got enough funding, she learned everything she could, because I think there would be overjoyed eczema patients everywhere.
A lot of the most exciting science coming out these days is from high-risk, high-payoff projects. And we've been fortunate in that we've received a lot of private donations to fund that. Really outside-the-box ideas, pushing the boundaries, not just accepting sort of the current dogma, but really sort of going out and doing high-risk research that allows us to push the envelope and make really breakthrough new discoveries.
If we don't have a pipeline of really talented, smart, ambitious people like Diana that want to come into the field, well then, we're not going to get there.
Sergio Pasca is one of our amazing young breakthrough scientists. One aspect of Sergio's work that I think is so phenomenal is that he's so focused on discovering the causes of autism, which is a worldwide problem, increasing in prevalence, increasing in detection, but in absolute numbers, the number of children with autism is just grown so much. And Sergio's work is really beginning to get at the basis of autism in a way that we've never been able to understand before.
I actually did not start by being fascinated by neuroscience or by brain sciences. My encounter during medical school with one of my first patients with autism is really what made a difference. You know, seeing the struggles of the parents on one side and just seeing how complex and, you know, puzzling this disorder really was is what sort of like what drew me towards the brain first, and then brain disorders sort of like broadly.
Violet's 9 years old, and she has a genetic condition that causes autism and epilepsy. Violet was born completely healthy, was meeting all of her milestones, and then we just, one night, she was making a weird sound in her crib, and we went over to her crib and she was blue, and there were bubbles coming out of her mouth, and we called 911 and we realized that it was a seizure, and they just continued. From that point, she's been a different child ever since than the child that we knew. Probably, you know, the most she's ever had, probably like 60 seizures in a day. And at one point, she was doing that weekly. When Violet seizes, she also stops breathing. And if it's been a minute or two, she's blue and she hasn't been breathing for 2 minutes. So we carry oxygen wherever we go. She has learning difficulties, memory difficulties. It's been very difficult for just watching her suffer, and she does suffer a lot.
One limitation to approaching the human brain and really understanding how it develops has to do with our lack of direct access to functional human brain tissue from patients. In studying cancer, you just essentially go and take a piece of tissue. You bring it into the lab, you put it in a dish, and you try to see what goes wrong and try to find ways of stopping that growth. We can't just do that for studying human brain disorders. We've been lucky to recruit Violet in our studies and harvest skin cells from her. And take those skin cells into the lab and turn them into stem cells. And stem cells have this amazing ability to turn into any other cell type. So of course we guide them to become brain cells. And we've been developing technology in the last few years to really take those stem cells and develop a three-dimensional living brain tissue from patients in a dish. You can actually see them by eye. They grow up to 4 or 5 millimeters in size. Essentially, there are like three-dimensional structures resembling the human brain that are derived non-invasively from a specific patient.
It's something I would never think was possible, or to create like a mini brain. Like how, that's something like out of a movie is the way that I would describe it, because that's the only way that it makes sense to me.
This is a tool that the scientific community can really use to derive human brain tissue from patients and ask questions about how the brain assembles itself and how then different brain regions talk to each other in a non-invasive way.
When your child is suffering and you don't know what's going to happen and if they're going to make it, you picture these people working really hard, with the lab coat thing, but really we do think that, like, there's these smart minds working on helping our kids, and that's sometimes all you have to hold on to. I don't know, what's going to happen to my daughter tomorrow, but I know that I don't want another parent to watch their child suffer this way. So yeah, it's really important to me to help other people so that in the future they don't have to suffer the way that my daughter does.
今年又是我们医学科学的发展主力军，所以说他们的提高可以对神经科学起很大作用，所以这里我们科室就是青年医生应该占我们的70%、80%。
None of the work that I do in my lab would be possible without the wonderful young people that I'm able to attract here. And because the work is so interdisciplinary, I'm fortunate to attract people from many different kinds of backgrounds.
It's going to take so many different disciplines and people to really push the boundaries, and the fact that the technology is ripe for that.
We need to bring engineers into the field. We need to bring physicists, statisticians, people from other disciplines to help us work on this. And the best way to do that is with funding interdisciplinary work.
All the great breakthroughs really are because you take a wonderful idea from one field and you bring it over to another field, and it just breaks it wide open.
All of human advance has really been based on our ability to create new tools. We evolved, our brains were shaped by millions of years of us learning to fashion stone tools. In fact, there's a view that those stone tools literally shaped our cortex. And this interplay between our technology and our neurology has always been there in our history and will be as we go forward. Artificial intelligence is another technology. It's going to be a set of tools that will change and extend us. I've been working in artificial intelligence for more than 30 years. I went up to read my PhD in the Department of Artificial Intelligence at the University of Edinburgh in 1978. So it's been an incredible journey, and we've seen huge developments in that time. When I began, we had a particular view about how you solve the problem, and it was to build so-called rule-based systems, that we thought that human intelligence was about manipulating symbols, using logic, And that first era of AI was very successful in doing that. But then we began to look at nature much more closely, to be inspired by animals and humans, and to take those ideas and engineer them in our devices. It was called biologically inspired robotics. We started to build programs based on actual human neural networks. And I was involved in that work myself. It was very exciting. The synergy between neuroscience and AI is a very deep one. So as we start to be inspired by actual neurons and build programs and computer programs that emulate that, as we do that, we start to be able to literally simulate aspects of human nervous processing. And this area of computational neuroscience is a really fast developing field. As we build our machine intelligences, they will be smart, but they're not smart like us. I always remind people that they should sometimes just open up the code, look inside the program, and what will strike you is what's missing. When you look at the texture and complexity of human life, all of the things that our brains are computing all of the time, only a tiny element of that is present in our artificial networks, in our AI systems. There is a whole dystopian tradition. Actually, in fact, if you look at Hollywood's portrayal of artificial intelligence, it's full of mad, bad, and dangerous to know robots. But the truth is, it's our decision about how we use these devices. It's our decision about how we regulate. The machines aren't about to wake up tomorrow and decide to put away with us. Those decisions are ones that we collectively make as a society. I remain incredibly excited by AI. In some respects, it's the most exciting time to be in the field, but it's always felt like that. And I think it's because we do see now a momentum, a general awareness, levels of funding, levels of actual deployment of real systems, where people can say, that's AI. They don't use the term in some kind of strange and confused manner. You're allowed to use it. You're given permission to use it, perhaps even too easily. But we expect our phones to recognize our voices, to recognize our faces. When I was growing up, that was the stuff of science fiction.
Computers have revolutionized the way we do science. Think going back to our grandparents. They had no idea about the internet, about smartphones, about electronics that we take for granted. All this didn't exist 100 years ago. And we see that the rapidity of advancement is just increasing. That speed is increasing. It requires quantitative understanding of the world around us to be able to take advantage of that and to use it for good. But if we do it right, human lives will be improved. Neuroscience is emblematic of the opportunities in science and technology. The basic biology of understanding how the brain works. The systems analysis of taking lots of pieces, lots of neurons, and understanding how they're put together. The way that the brain understands the world, the way that it represents the world to people, the way that we can overcome problems, medical issues that people have if we understand how the brain works. These are all ripe for investigation.
In my generation, many people went into psychology, but at the time, I thought that to really understand the brain required understanding the biology behind thought and other higher processes. I've been studying the posterior parietal cortex, the place where intent and the awareness of intent are first formed. Based on this research, we began to think that we could design smart computers that could analyze people's intentions, tap into the commands that will go out to the body to form actions. A brain-machine interface is a machine that's connected directly to the brain to receive signals. Then it usually also has a component that decodes or makes sense of those signals. You know, when you go to reach for a glass of water, you don't think how your fingers are configured and how much force you have to apply. You just have the intent to reach for the glass. And so we thought we'd tap into those high-level signals to help patients who are paralyzed. Eric Sorto is locally from Los Angeles, and in his early 20s, he had a gunshot wound to his neck, and as a result, he can't move any of his limbs, his legs or his arms. So the first step with Eric was to implant electrodes into his brain. This was done with a brain surgery. Arrays of electrodes were placed within the posterior parietal cortex. The basic aim of the work is for him to be able to control his environment just with his thoughts.
The first time I made the robotic arm work, it was an out-of-body experience. I was so excited. I wish I could jump out of my wheelchair and high-five everybody because it was just so amazing and so easy. I didn't expect it to be so easy.
The implant itself is very tiny. It's 4 by 4 millimeters, and it has 100 electrodes on it to record from a population of neurons. Then we connect the subject to the machines that interpret their brain signals.
I just seen the project as something that can bring so much independence to people in my condition.
One of our patients can also play piano just with her thoughts. Just the intent to move the fingers can be used for a variety of applications. We've been able to distinguish and decode some things that are preconscious. And so we can actually design decoders that can decode activity before you're aware of it. Many people are very interested in the possibility of this being used in healthy people for augmentation. You could imagine things like direct communications through thought between people, being able to increase strength by brain control of an exoskeleton. We've also found that we can input signals by stimulation of the brain. So you can imagine getting your email or looking something up on Google just by thinking about it. So in a sense, having a cell phone in the brain.
I never dreamed that anything of this was possible, but after seeing the results, I can see how the sky's the limit with the project because it's so successful and we do accomplish pretty much magic here.
Right now is not only the most exciting time in neuroscience, it's the most exciting time in science, period, that I've lived through in my 40 years of doing science.
Neuroscience is truly at an inflection point, and I think that because of all the advances that we've made in so many different fields that are going to converge, it'll be a limitless frontier.
The benefits for everyone are just enormous. The possibilities of understanding and curing disorders, treating psychiatric illness, and then to understand basic science, I think we're at the tipping point now.
All of us together, I think we need to actually believe that, like any other organs, that the brain can also be repaired.
We're aspiring for everyone to have a good life, for people with severe illnesses to live full lives, lives rich with recovery and joy and contribution.
We have to discover what the brain can do and where it can take us and help us and benefit mankind.
Now we have momentum. With all these new tools and technologies, the investment can go much farther now. We can take enormous quantum leaps forward.
I'd like to think about the decision in the 60s to send a human being to the moon and bring them back again. In the process, we developed technologies that have profoundly affected the civilization.
So many of our problems in the world are based on behavior, drug addiction to wars. So that is really essentially important for advancing humanity.
In neuroscience, now is always a good time. The continuing present we're in it calls for work, it calls for action. And with the right support, you will really catalyze those fields to produce more than the sum of their parts.
We have an opportunity now, like we've had few times before, to move forward at a rapid pace with the appropriate resources. We also have the opportunity to take full advantage of the skills of more and more young people across the world, and to be able to excite them about contributing to the betterment of the human condition.
We are closer than ever to unlocking the potential of the human brain. But to push through the last remaining barriers, we need more fundamental research and more young scientists to conduct it, with support not just from governments and private funding, but every member of society. When our minds are wide open, the possibilities are truly limitless.